Record to the cloud. There we go. Hi guys, so welcome. We are going over the contingency forms today, the SPRP and the COP. Those are fancy acronyms for basically anytime you have a client who is going to be selling a property in order to buy a property. So we're going to be jumping in today and kind of doing a very kind of layman's terms explanation on them, because they are, I think, some of the most, well, at least the SPRP is not too bad, but the COP is definitely very complicated. So we're going to do a deeper dive on it. We're lucky enough to have Niki Conrad with us, who is a certified car forms trainer. So she's going to do her kind of language on how it reads. And I'm going to be here to kind of talk a little more street level, even though I'm sure Niki can talk to that as well. So let's get right into it. Niki, do you want to share your screen and take us from there? And I don't care if we start with the COP or SPRP. I don't know if it really matters.
We'll start with the COP. I think that's the one that's the most difficult to understand.
I agree.
Okay.
You just modified this one in December, so it'll be kind of nice to talk about, you know, how it reads now.
Yes, although I still feel this is one of those forms, for me at least, that I had to read quite a few times to understand. And I actually have done a couple times. I did talk earlier in the purchase contract about going to the forms trainer, and you can look at the forms, and CAR gives you the simple verbiage for forms. So I've done that a couple times with this actual form. Are you guys seeing my screen?
We can see the contingency for sale of buyer's property. Yeah.
Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So if you're in the purchase contract and you're writing your purchase contract and your buyer cannot purchase the property unless they sell their home, you're going to click that it is contingent on the purchase, on the sale of buyer's property. And when you do that, Zip Forms will add this form to your transaction, the contingency for sale of buyer's property, otherwise known as the COP. This is an addendum to the purchase contract. You would date it the same day as the purchase contract is drawn up. Buyer's property. So Brianna's buying 819 4th Street. Her property is 6600 Warner Avenue. Okay. So buyer's property contingency. This agreement is contingent upon A, buyer entering into a contract for the sale and closing escrow on buyer's property, which means Brianna cannot buy 4th Street unless she sells Warner. Or B, this property is contingent only on entering into a contract for the sale of buyer's property, which would mean that Brianna just needs to enter into contract to purchase on Warner before purchasing 4th Street. But it's not, Warner does not need to close escrow. Okay. Or C, only the close of escrow of buyer's property. And that would be if 6600 Warner was already in escrow. So then you would fill out buyer's property is already in escrow with all coast escrow 0189654-W. A copy of the contract for sale of buyer's property and the contact information and escrow number for that sale is attached to this COP form, is the default, or will be delivered within 2 days. Are you all clear on that? It defaults to the buyer has to go into escrow and sell their property to buy the new one. B is they just need to go into escrow on their own property. And C means that they've already gone into escrow. Okay.
And remember that in this market, guys, sometimes it's, it's so competitive that, if you're using a form like this, they may not want to agree. Like the default, like Nikki said, is both. It's not just getting into escrow, but it's also closing, right? So they may only allow you to be contingent on opening escrow, right? So that's why that option B and C is there, which is different from the old way it used to be for those that are seasoned on the call, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it wasn't as clear as it is here.
And before, you didn't even have to show, it wasn't written that you had to show proof. Okay, we're all clear on that. Buyer entering into contract for sale of buyer's property. If you choose 1A or 1B, default is buyer shall have 17 days after acceptance to enter into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. So Brianna has 17 days to sell 6600 Warner Avenue. You can make that time shorter, or you can make that time longer. But this is, again, something that sellers and listing agents may counter you on. Okay. By the early of the time specified here, the 17 days, or within 2 days after the buyer enters into contract for the sale, buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to seller and escrow holder. So Brianna has 17 days to sell the property, but if she sells it in 10, she has 2 days to get proof of entering into escrow to the seller and listing agent. Questions on that?
You should have kept that in here, Mom. You should have kept the small one so we could just dump it.
Hi, Stacy. Hi, Jeannie.
I'm gonna mute them just so we don't have any background noise. But if you guys have questions, unmute yourselves.
Quick thing right here. If you do a purchase contract with a 30-day close of escrow, you don't really want to make this 30 days. I've seen that happen a couple times recently, and it doesn't work that way. Most sellers won't agree to do that. All right, moving on. Listing and MLS status of buyer's property. If you went with 1A or 1B, buyer has signed a listing agreement for buyer's property, or shall within 3 days after acceptance sign a listing. And you would put your real estate brokerage here. If they're doing it with you, you would put Coastal Alliance. If they're from out of state and they're using some other realtor, you would put that brokerage name there. Buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where the buyer's property is located, or buyer's property will not be submitted into the MLS in the geographical area where the property is located. So it defaults that you are absolutely putting it in the MLS, but if you check this box, it means that you're not going to put the property in the MLS.
And
Buyer shall do. Go
for those
ahead.
of you, yeah, for those of you that have seen this form before, this is kind of nice now because now they're being very clear that there's actually a signed listing agreement, because that would be a question, right? Because sometimes your buyers will be out there shopping, but they have to sell their house in order to buy. So there was no way to really be like super clear about like, well, do you have a signed listing agreement? You know, like what's going on? I think before it would just talked about whether it was like in the MLS or not or something to that degree, correct? So now it's taking it almost a step back from that. Like, well, do you just at least have the signed agreement to market their property? So if we do accept your offer, at least we know that that's happening. So that's kind of nice that this is in here now.
Okay, and then it takes it one step further. The buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and, if applicable, the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance. Right? So a lot of what they did when they changed this form is they made it clear that every step of this process, the buyer has to show evidence of what has taken place. Evidence of the listing, evidence of the MLS, evidence of going into escrow. Okay. If 1A or 1C applies, remember both 1A and 1C are the close of escrow. Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. The scheduled close of escrow of 4th Street or if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property. This form is kind of confusing because it's buyer's property, seller's property. So a lot of times it's easier for me when I go over the form to actually assign a person and assign 2 different addresses. So that way I can keep it straight. Okay, so the buyer Brianna has until the close of escrow, 6600 Warmer, to the scheduled close of escrow on 4th Street to sell 6600 Warner, or she has to sell 6600 Warner no later than 5 days prior to the 4th Street close of escrow. Once the buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use the contingency to cancel the agreement. Does that make sense? I mean, that one does make sense. Does the other stuff make sense?
Yeah, it does. But Nikki, wouldn't you advise that you'd normally say like no later than 2 days at least, because you close one and close the next one the next day?
Yes, I absolutely would.
Yeah. Okay.
The people on this call that have been in real estate for a while, we used to be able to do concurrent closings. That's not possible anymore. I mean, the logistics of that just doesn't happen. So absolutely, you want at least 2 days, if not more. Okay, moving on. Status of sale of buyer's property. 1A or 1C applies. Buyer agrees to keep the seller informed about the status of the transaction, including any changes, modifications, or addenda or amendment to the terms of the accepted offer, or delays to or removal of contingencies. Most importantly here would be if there's any extension of times, or if the buyer of Brianna's home isn't removing contingencies in time. Everyone needs to know this information for all the transactions to move smoothly. And I can't stress that enough, because in contingent escrows, everybody just gets a little more nervous than they normally do. And the not knowing tends to make everything a little bit crazier. So when the buyer's buyer removes a contingency, they let the seller know. If the buyer's buyer does an extension of time, you let the seller know, and everybody can act accordingly.
And what's nice about that, guys, is in the past, I mean, there was nothing really binding the buyer to update the seller, right? I mean, there was really nothing, right, Nikki? There was nothing in the contract that really said anything. It was like, okay, you get this random like 17 days or 21 days or whatever you agreed to get this done. But it was up to that listing agent to be like following up like crazy. And it's nice that now it's contractually says like, you've got to let people know what's going on. So I like number 5. I think that's a good addition to this form.
Okay. Within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of the removal of those identified contingencies. You can no longer have passive removal. You always have to have something in writing saying that you are removing a contingency. Years and years ago, there used to be a box you could check in the purchase contract that said passive removal of contingencies. That's no longer allowed. And I would never recommend that if somebody were to write that in a contract. Okay, cancellation of buyer's property. If buyer's property is in or enters escrow, and either party to that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation of contract, buyer within 2 days shall deliver to seller written notice of the cancellation. So if Brianna's house escrow gets canceled, she has to let that seller know in 2 days that the escrow is canceled. All right. We're just going to blow right through this one.
Yeah.
Backup offer. and seller right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. Okay. After acceptance, the seller shall have the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that the broker shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. What this means, you guys, is the listing agent can't leave it active. They can put it in active under contract, which means you're still accepting backup offers. Okay, I want to make sure we're all clear on that, because if you left it active, you could be in violation of the CRMLS rules. Removal of buyer contingencies and proof of funds. Unless 7C3 is selected, and this is a little hard to grasp sometimes, if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the specified time in 7C3, right here, or 2, seller shall have the right to give written notice to the buyer to, in writing, remove this contingency, remove their loan contingency, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of the buyer's property. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after the delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing.
So like, just to go street level on like what Niki's talking about here is basically, if you look at item 7C 1, 2, and 3, that really helps answer the question, because it's really just what can the seller do with a backup offer should they get one, right? So if you look at 7C 1, it says that they can basically accept a backup offer and kick the buyer out within 2 days, right? It defaults to 2 days there, if that's what you leave it at, 2 days, and kick them out at any time. Then you've got 7C2, which talks a little bit more. Oh, here you go. You got a little side thing here. I love it, Nikki. Good job. Seller has agreed that for a specified time, seller does not have the right to require the buyer to take those actions. So yeah, I think it defaults to 17 days. Is that right, Nikki?
Yes, it does.
So you got 17 days, or I'm sure a lot of buyers would maybe want to extend that depending on their contingencies on the other property. Maybe they do like 21 days. That's a little tough to push that in this market because it's very much a seller's market, but you could try to extend that. And then 7C3 makes that entire thing null and void, because 7C3 says that the seller cannot invoke a backup offer and kick them out at all. So in order to understand 7, look at 7C 1, 2, and 3. It's really all about timelines for how a seller could accept a backup offer, if even possible, to kick the current buyer out. Correct? Or give them, I should say 2 days to perform. I shouldn't say kick them out, but 2 days to perform.
And yeah, so 7C, time given to give notice to remove contingencies. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice provisions that we just talked about. 1, immediate right to notify buyer anytime after acceptance. That's the default. If you represent a buyer, you don't want 7C1, okay? Or 2, delayed right to notify buyer no earlier than 17 days after acceptance. So you guys make sure you look at that, no earlier. So the seller, if you check this, that you have 17 days for Brianna to sell her home without the seller being able to give her the notice to remove the contingency. Or 7C3, no right to notify the buyer. If you really want to protect your buyer, you don't want the seller to ever be able to ask the buyer to remove all these contingencies. Because here's the thing, most of the time, if you're using this form, you're using it because your buyer cannot buy the property without selling their own property. And you don't ever want to be put into a situation where the seller can say, the buyer has to remove the close of escrow contingency, the buyer has to remove their loan contingency, and you got to show me enough funds to close escrow right now on our property. So to represent your buyers, you want to either check delayed right to notify buyer or no right to notify buyer. Any questions on this? Because this is the confusing part of this form. And there's no silly questions or dumb questions or anything like that. I've heard them all, and I'm sure Nick's heard them all. And usually they're questions we've had at one point.
Nikki, is there someplace here that says when you're going to actually open escrow and start the
Yes.
proceedings? Okay.
Coming up.
Yeah, that's in number 11. Okay, number 9, seller right to cancel. Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. After first giving buyer written notice to remove buyer contingencies and provide proof of funds. So if they give a notice to perform and buyer doesn't provide those things, they can cancel after the 48 hours. After first giving a notice to perform, if buyer fails to enter into contract for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified. So if the buyer doesn't sell their house within the 17 days, the seller can give them a notice to perform. After first giving a notice to perform, if buyer fails to close escrow for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. So this is another thing where I want to point out, if you have an open dialogue with the listing agent, and let's say there's an extension and the listing agent knows and the seller knows, then more than likely they're not going to give you a notice to perform. But if all of a sudden you get to the close of escrow, and then you're like, oh gosh, we need 2 more days, nobody's happy. Okay. After first giving a notice to perform, if buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence in that 3 days, the seller can cancel. After giving a notice to perform, if buyer fails to deliver evidence of listing of buyer's property or the submission of the property into the MLS, if buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies in the sale of buyer's property, if buyer gives notice to the seller of either party's cancellation of contract, the seller can cancel. So these are really important things to pay attention to. None of this was required before, but now all of it is required, and the seller can cancel if you don't give them this evidence. And if the buyer's buyer cancels, then the seller can cancel. Okay, so those are important. And if you're representing a seller, you want to have all this evidence. If you don't have this kind of evidence, are you really protecting that seller? Okay, buyer right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal of the buyer's property contingency, buyer is unable to enter into contract on buyer's property within the time specified. Either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract. Buyer is unable to close escrow on buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. Okay, no questions. This is the important one. Time for performance of contract obligation and delivery of buyer deposit. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall begin as specified in the agreement. So right now, this means that after you go into escrow, the very next, or after you sign the contract, the very next day is day 1. And the buyer has 17 days to do buyer investigations and get their property into escrow.
And everybody understands that when it says in the agreement, it means the RPA, like the purchase agreement that's in play here, that this would be
Yeah.
attached to. Okay, just want to clarify that.
Or if you check this box, what it means is those first 17 days that the buyer has to sell their home, the timeline for the actual contract doesn't start until the day after buyer's home and it is in escrow. So if Brianna has 17 days to get her property into escrow and she gets it into escrow on the 10th day, the timeline for 4th Street starts on that 10th day. So buyer doesn't have to start her investigations, her appraisal timeline, her loan timeline doesn't start until 10 days into the agreement. A lot of people, when they represent their buyers, they want to check this box because it gives your buyer doesn't have to pay for the property inspection or doesn't have to pay for the appraisal until they know that their property is in escrow.
But remember, in this market, just to play devil's advocate, I mean, just remember that in this market, it's super, super tough to get those boxes sometimes checked because that listing agent already feels like they're taking a gamble that you have a property to sell in order to buy this one. So to get those boxes checked, sometimes you will see them countered out on counter offers. You know, don't be surprised, I guess, if you write a contingent offer and they're countered out because they don't necessarily, maybe they want all of your timelines to start now. They don't want to wait until that property's in escrow. But I do agree with Nikki, as protecting your buyer, you would want to check those boxes.
And 11B, buyer's deposit, the default is it goes into escrow within 3 business days of opening escrow, or if you check the box within 3 business days after buyer delivers to seller evidence of escrow, or buyer's election in writing signed by buyer to begin time periods, or buyer's removal of this buyer property contingency. Okay, both buyer and seller need to sign. And if the seller was to invoke their notice provisions, they would sign this form and send it to the buyer. Okay, any questions regarding this?
Hi, this is Tom. How are you?
Hi, Tom.
Hi, I
Doing
just
well.
came on a little bit late, so you guys might have gone over this, but I'm kind of in this situation, but not on my end because my buyers are living in an apartment. But it's kind of like this daisy chain effect where the listing agent, that we bought from and are in escrow with, they have to buy the house next. So they are probably doing this kind of contract, I hope, um, with their next house. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I just feel like, I guess my general question would be, there's a lot of juggling going on in terms of protecting everybody's rights and also getting the dates to line up properly. So I don't know if you'll go into any hints and tips about dealing with that. Maybe it's going through a transaction coordinator to do that, but that's just, it seems so convoluted when you have that daisy chain effect. Anyway, thank you.
So it can be very convoluted and there can be a lot of dates. My big question, Tom, would be when that seller signed the contract with your buyer, did they give you a seller's purchase of replacement property?
I'm sorry, what was that term again?
Did the seller give you with your contract a seller's purchase of replacement property?
No, they did not.
Okay. So in terms of your deal, that's great because your close of escrow is not contingent on that seller purchasing a new property.
Well, it is because, I mean, I don't, you know who it is, but they're also very ambiguous with their dialogue, and they wrote it in to the, RPA counteroffer that it's contingent upon the sale of the sellers or the concurrent escrow with the seller's next home.
Okay.
So it's in a very ambiguous way. I think he might have played it right where he's protecting his clients. And it's good for us in the sense that we're not putting on a timeline and a ticking time bomb here, but at the same time it also pushes that escrow, and I can talk to you offline about this if this is too specific, but it also pushes that escrow time to go further, and we could be locked in there without that SPRP indefinitely if they just keep looking and decide not to make any offers, which I know they are, but I'm just, you know what I'm trying to say? Like 4 months can go along and it's like we're still locked
Yeah.
in because we didn't have that SPRP. Anyway, that's, yeah.
So just for everyone on this call, if you ever receive a purchase contract from or a counteroffer back from a listing agent that says that it's contingent, you need to reply or you need to send over the SPRP yourself. Because you definitely do not want to be stuck in a situation where you're waiting forever for the seller to enter into a purchase. I know in your case, it's already happened. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that you can absolutely tell the seller that they have to give you this form, or you can fill the form out and send it back to them.
It just seems so tricky because the language is so harsh in the sense of like, okay, you guys got to get into escrow with the new house by 17 days. Otherwise, we can pull out and this and that. I mean, I know that a contingency can just stay in place forever until we want to pull it, and that's what the point of the SPRP is. I don't know. I guess that is. I just answered my own question.
So here's the funny thing. In being a transaction coordinator, forms don't have tone, and they aren't harsh or unharsh. They're just contracts. And all that these contracts do is clarify and protect both parties in the transaction. So it protects you and your client, if it's a buyer, by making it so that they don't have to wait 40 days for the seller to go into escrow, because that's not fair to anyone. So I think we'll just segue right into the seller's purchase of replacement property.
Nikki, real quick, you referenced Forms Trainer, and I know you told us before, but where do we find that?
Okay, so let's see. So I went back to this, I think it's not the very first page, but it's the second page. Transaction Center, Form Advisor, and Forms Tutor, right here at the bottom. If you click on that, you don't want this first one. But if you go to Access Forms Tutor, make me log in again. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to go to the COP form. And what it does is all of these little blue dots, if you click on that, it gives you little street verbiage, if you want, of this form.
Oh my gosh, Nikki, we never have to teach a forms class again.
That's right.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. We'll just cancel all Thursdays for the rest of the year. You guys can go in here and just click around. This is amazing. Love it.
This is very cool. I really like this. And I'm not gonna lie, I obviously the little bit I pulled up for you earlier, I got directly from here. And this has a whole bunch of forms on it. We could do it with it's all alphabetical. The first one is the purchase contract, which I talked about last time. That one you actually have to email to yourself, but all the rest of these forms, it's not every single form you can pull up. So here's the seller's purchase of replacement property.
Nikki, a random question. Does Glide automatically pre-populate these when you open up a new buyer's transaction?
Well, it can, but only if you've set up the verbiage. It will automatically pre-populate the buyer's name and the address, but any of the filling in of the lines or like the day verbiage, you can set it up so that Glide will put that stuff into the form, but it's something you have to do. It's an extra step.
I guess I was asking, like, when you click on I mean, I should do this myself. I'm just lazy here. If you open up a new buyer transaction, does it kind of itemize the different contract forms for you already, just to make it easier so that you can go, okay, of course, these are the forms that I have to fill out when I'm putting in an offer and this and that. And
Only if you've set up a template.
okay, great.
Okay. All right. So, okay. This is the seller's purchase of replacement property. Provides a contingency in favor of the seller for the seller's purchase of replacement property. Sometimes sellers do not want to sell their own property if they are uncertain about whether they can buy something themselves. Seller's concern could be based upon the difficulty of finding property, especially in this market right now. And the seller just wants the security of knowing that the seller has a permanent place to be once their own property has been sold. That's why they have this form. Finding replacement property. This agreement is contingent on seller entering into a contract to acquire a replacement property. Seller shall, within 17 days after acceptance, remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement. Seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time. Buyer, after first giving a notice to seller to perform, may cancel the agreement in writing. So I'm wondering, Tom, if you didn't have an actual time frame and it's been 17 days, I will check up on this, but I believe that you can give a notice to perform.
Well, we don't
If
want
they have
to.
not, okay, so that's the other thing. Never give a notice to perform unless you're ready to.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
For it to have teeth. But you could also try sending them an extension of time and narrow down those dates. Like say the seller has 2 more weeks to find a replacement property.
Yeah.
I know it's really tough right now because there's so few listings and everybody's writing a ton of offers.
Yeah. I'm glad we have that option. I just, think they have the time, and we'll give the other listing agent an opportunity.
Good. Okay. All right. So that's A, where they would have 17 days, or you can make it more. And B is seller has entered into a contract to acquire replacement property already. And they would have to list their escrow holder and the escrow number. Okay. And C, if checked, means they have to be able to close escrow on the replacement property. This agreement is contingent on seller's ability to close escrow on replacement property according to that contract. Any questions on that? In this situation, in C, the buyer is at risk throughout the entire escrow period because either the seller or the seller's seller may take some action that causes that escrow to fail, which would in turn cause the failure of the escrow for the buyer's sale of seller's property to buyer. Because the buyer is at risk, if the seller cancels, the buyer may not want to spend money on inspections and reports until the seller has removed the contingency with seller finding or closing upon replacement property. So with that, we go right into time periods. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from date of acceptance shall begin the day after seller delivers to buyer a written notice to remove finding replacement property contingency. So this one is flip-flopped. In the COP, you have to check the box to make the buyer's timeframes start later. But on the SPRP, it defaults to the buyer doesn't have to do anything until the seller gets into escrow. Or you check the box for the timelines to remain as specified in the agreement.
So if you're a listing agent, guys, you really want to make sure that 2A is checked so that things start now.
Right. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 business days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing this contingency, or check the box as specified in the agreement. Again, if you represent the seller, you want to make sure that buyer gets their deposit into escrow as soon as possible. Okay. Close of escrow. Buyer and seller agree that the seller may extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for a maximum of these additional days or until that a specific date by providing buyer with written notice at the time seller removes the finding replacement property contingency specified in 1A. So if the parties desire to, there are boxes to check that would provide that the timeframes for the buyer's inspection and contractual obligations, including the deposit, would start. Okay, that's the wrong circle for this verbiage, but all right. If the seller wants to, once they get into escrow, they can extend this escrow for the additional, I don't know, 2 weeks, 14 days, or until March 31st. That would be what would happen if you check these boxes. Any other terms you can put in here? Even after the expiration of the time for the finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels pursuant to paragraph 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal of the finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel pursuant to paragraph 1A. Both buyer and seller need to sign this form. Any questions?
Sorry to dominate this conversation. I hope it's going to help everybody because this is the situation I'm in. This is the seller's market right now. And again, referring back to mine, they had put in their provision saying, 10 days inspection, 13 days appraisal, and 17 days for loan. It seems like they want their cake and eat it too. And I just feel like this, I should have obviously have taken this, lesson here a month ago. But it seems like when they have that request, it's almost like they have that, they have you by the ropes, I guess. If you can,
yeah, fill in what you will. Yeah, they do. In a seller's market, when you're filling out these forms, it usually behooves the seller and not the buyer.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like thinking back to how I could have done this differently, but it seems that no matter what, those were the terms that that listing agent wanted, which is essentially that this would not happen. You would have to enter into escrow immediately. You will do the inspections within the 10 days. You will have, blah, 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 blah. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
It does. And even in Nick, I don't know if Nick stepped away.
I'm here.
You're here. So Nick, if you were in the same situation and the seller wrote that into the contract or into the seller's counteroffer, if you represent the buyer, really you need to come back with this form. Even in a seller's market, it's not unreasonable to put a cap on how many days the buyer is willing to wait. Because the way it's written now, it's open-ended. Your buyer could be, any buyer could be stuck waiting almost 6 months for the seller to get an accepted offer. And that you've got to protect your buyer, even in a seller market. And most listing agents that I know of aren't going to insist that a buyer just wait forever.
All right, so then I'll ask the question, am I legally on the hook here? I mean, did I fail to do my job? I mean, like, that's the worry here.
I don't think, no, I don't.
Because
No.
they
In
agreed
this
to everything,
business,
obviously, right? The seller doesn't have to
yeah,
sign off on anything. Okay, well,
I would
anyway, I don't mean to
again,
be personal, but
no, it's okay. I would again talk with your buyers and figure out like an amount of time that they're willing to wait, and send an extension of time, and just
okay.
say, we want to clarify, we want to nail things down. And if you come at it as, my buyer has paid for the inspection, my buyer has paid for the appraisal, we're in this to close it, but I need to protect my buyer in a way that they're not hanging on forever, and
Yeah,
they're
I'm not
not
too worried about
continuing
that. So,
to pay
thank you
rent,
though. I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate
yeah,
all this. I'm not too worried, but I'm just asking the questions. Thank you guys for indulging me on something very
sure.
specific.
Yeah. Anyone else got questions regarding these forms? And trust me, I've seen all of these things happen. I've seen ones where, I've been in ones where every deal was contingent, and that can be insanely crazy. I definitely recommend, if you are in a trail of contingent properties, to almost print out a calendar for like the 2 months, whatever time period it is, and put every timeline, every date on that timeline for each of the sister transactions. So
And
that way,
And Nikki's spot on with the calendar thing. I have one listings bringing a calendar into the listing agreement. Like, they didn't even honestly care what I had to talk to them about marketing. They just wanted to know how we were going to get it done. And I've gotten listings literally just by having a calendar. So what Nikki just said is huge, especially if you're dealing with a contingent client. And remember, we're bringing this training to you guys today because the inventory is so tight. And these forms have been around for a very long time. But the reason why they're so important is because you can have that conversation with your clients who are like, well, yeah, I can sell my house in 24 hours, but how am I going to buy something? And so these are the forms you can use in your conversations with them to really show them, here's how I protect you. We've got the SPRP trailing behind you. We've got the COP going into the future with you, into your new home. And we put them together in order to give you not just one level of protection, but 2 levels of protection. So if you guys ever need help with that kind of dialogue, that's something I hope you take away from the training today, because that really is a huge, I think, added benefit to understanding these forms.
yeah, I second what Nick said.
Avoid the homelessness, right?
And just protect your sellers as well as you can. I know this is a little outside of what we're talking about right now, but if you use Gmail, they have an add-on that's free, and it's called Folio. And what it does is it gives you a calendar of all your transactions. And what happens is, with each email that you open regarding that property, you can see a timeline right next to you that shows you everything. So if you ever need help with that or want to look at it, just let me know. It really does help me keep track of everything in my files. Here, I'll show you one. Okay. New screen share. Oh, it doesn't like me this morning. Top share. Okay. So this is folio right here. And if you look, it's got the offer accepted date, buyer's investigation, when the earnest money is due, when the seller's repairs are due, estimated closing days. In this one, the seller was renting back. So that's the date the buyer gets possession. But when I have contingent properties, I put in the contingent dates. So in here would be buyer to sell their property, and I'd put the date in there. And that way I can see these things. Calendars really, really help. Or you can do it on your Google Calendar, or you can do it on your file. Or if you're a visual person like me, you can go on Pinterest and just print out calendars. Or you can get one of those great calendars, desk calendars from the title reps. Okay, any questions? We're all good on this form? Well, that's awesome.
I think so. Guys, if you have any questions, obviously reach out to Nikki, reach out to myself. Nicole Tutil in Lakewood is amazing as well. There's so many people that can help you with this. So feel free to reach out to us when you have a situation that brings this into view, okay?
All right, you all have a great day. And let's hope everybody finds home for their buyers and gets everyone into escrow.
I agree. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.